When Dmitry Medvedev's plane touched down in Tehran, the official purpose was mourning. Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader for over 3 decades, had died. Delegations arrived from across the anti-Western world, representatives from Syria, Venezuela, North Korea, militant groups from Lebanon and Yemen. Russia sent one of its most powerful figures, Medvedev, former president, current deputy chairman of the Security Council, and one of Vladimir Putin's closest confidants. But within hours of landing, something unexpected happened. Medvedev didn't issue statements about Iran, he issued warnings about Germany. The messages were stark. Berlin was approaching unacceptable red lines. Germany's military support for Ukraine risked crossing thresholds Moscow would not tolerate. Simultaneously, Russian state media amplified synchronized statements. Belarus was inviolable Russian territory. Any threat to Lukashenko's regime would be met with tactical nuclear weapons. The warnings weren't subtle, and they weren't aimed at Tehran. Russia had used a funeral in Iran to redraw the borders of Europe. This wasn't diplomatic protocol. It was strategic messaging delivered from calculated distance, timed to coincide with leadership transition in Tehran and political fracture in Berlin. While analysts focused on who would succeed, Khamenei Moscow was signaling a new security architecture to European capitals, one where Russia's periphery expands westward and Germany's choices narrow. Most observers saw condolence diplomacy. Russia saw an opportunity to establish facts while Western intelligence scrambled to decode why threats to Germany were being issued from Iranian soil. The answer connects 3 seemingly unrelated elements: Tehran's succession crisis, Europe's energy vulnerability, and Moscow's assessment that the moment to reshape Eastern Europe is now. Khamenei's death didn't just trigger succession planning in Tehran, it created a diplomatic moment that Iran's partners moved quickly to exploit. Within 24 hours, delegations were en route from Moscow, Beijing, Damascus, and Caracas. Each wanted to signal continuity to whoever emerged from Iran's opaque leadership selection process. Russia's choice of envoy communicated weight. Dmitry Medvedev, former president and current deputy chairman of the Security Council, carries authority that transcends ceremonial attendance. But Medvedev's mission operated on multiple tracks simultaneously. The funeral provided cover. The substance targeted Europe. During his time in Tehran, Medvedev issued public warnings framed around Germany's Ukraine policy. Berlin, he stated, was approaching unacceptable thresholds, potential deployment of long-range weapon systems capable of striking deep into Russian territory, hypothetical NATO infrastructure expansion near Kaliningrad, military support that Moscow considered escalatory. The language was deliberate, not conditional warnings, but statements of proximity to red lines already defined. Simultaneously, Russian state media published coordinated statements on Belarus. The messaging was unambiguous. Belarus constituted integral Russian security space. Lukashenko's regime was non-negotiable. Any external threat, the statement specifically referenced scenarios involving Polish or Baltic intervention, would justify tactical nuclear weapons use. Medvedev personally endorsed this position, transforming what might have been state media posturing into official Russian Security Council doctrine. The 3 tracks, funeral attendance, German warnings, Belarus formalization, were presented separately, but designed as integrated strategy. Western intelligence agencies initially compartmentalized them. Middle East analysts covered the Tehran visit, Europe desks tracked the Germany statements, regional specialists monitored Belarus rhetoric. Few connected the structure. Timing amplified impact. Germany's coalition government was visibly fracturing over Ukraine aid and defense spending. EU unity on continued support showed strain as economic costs mounted. Iran's leadership transition created genuine uncertainty about Tehran's future strategic orientation. Russia launched this diplomatic offensive into multiple simultaneous vulnerabilities, using a funeral as the platform and calculated distance as the method. The location wasn't incidental, it was the strategy. Russia's claim that Belarus represents integral Russian territory isn't new rhetoric, it's the culmination of a process that began with the 1999 Union State Agreement. That treaty, signed by Boris Yeltsin and Alexander Lukashenko, created a nominal confederation. Shared currency, customs, integration, coordinated foreign policy. For 2 decades, it remained largely theoretical. Lukashenko balanced between Moscow and the West, extracting subsidies from Russia while maintaining enough independence to avoid full absorption. That balance collapsed in 2020. Belarus's disputed presidential election triggered mass protests that Lukashenko survived only with direct Russian support security assistance media backing economic lifelines. Western sanctions followed severing Belarus from European markets and pushing Minsk completely into Moscow's orbit. By February 2022, Belarus had become the staging ground for Russia's Northern Axis invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces launched from Belarusian territory toward Kiev. The line between theoretical alliance and operational integration had been crossed. Belarus was no longer a buffer state, it was Russian strategic depth. Russia's warnings to Germany tap deeper historical grievances. Moscow has never accepted NATO's eastward expansion, particularly the 2004 inclusion of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former Soviet republics now hosting alliance infrastructure within proximity to St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. Russia frames this as encirclement, a violation of assurances Moscow claims were given during German reunification negotiations. Whether those assurances were explicit or implied remains disputed, but Russia's perception of betrayal is genuine and drives current policy. Germany occupies a unique position in this narrative. Despite being NATO's European economic anchor, Berlin has historically been viewed by Moscow as potentially pliable, capable of pragmatism when energy and economic interests align. The Nord Stream pipeline symbolized this relationship. Germany gained energy security and industrial competitiveness through cheap Russian gas, while Russia gained revenue and political leverage. The 2022 pipeline sabotage severed that dependency, but Moscow continues testing whether German risk aversion and economic pain might recreate leverage through different means. The current warnings represent that test. Russia-Iran coordination follows a separate but parallel evolution. Cold War arms sales laid the foundation, but mutual isolation from Western markets transformed the relationship into comprehensive defense partnership. Iran supplies Shahed drones that Russia uses extensively in Ukraine. Russia provides diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, advanced military technology, and satellite intelligence sharing. The partnership isn't ideological, it's transactional, built on converging interests against a common adversary. Khamenei's death introduces succession uncertainty into this equation. Iran's leadership selection process is opaque, and new leaders occasionally shift strategic orientation. Russia's high-level presence at the funeral serves as insurance locking in commitments with whoever emerges from the succession process. Authoritarian states routinely use leadership transitions in partner nations to formalize relationships before new leadership potentially recalibrates. Medvedev's attendance sends a message to Tehran's incoming power structure. Continuity serves mutual interests, and Russia will invest in maintaining it. History provides the tools, but it doesn't explain why Moscow believes those tools will work. Now, when previous pressure campaigns against Europe produced limited results, Russia's strategy operates on three interconnected levels that Western intelligence agencies initially analyzed separately, a compartmentalization that Moscow anticipated and exploited. The first level is the platform itself. Tehran wasn't chosen for convenience. It was chosen for message multiplication. By delivering warnings to Germany from Iranian soil, Russia demonstrated that its non-Western partnerships remain operationally robust despite 3 years of unprecedented sanctions. The optics matter strategically. Medvedev, standing alongside delegations from Syria, Venezuela, and Hezbollah, signals that Russia has constructed an alternative diplomatic ecosystem, one that doesn't require Western approval or participation. This isn't theater. Iran provides the drones Russia uses daily in Ukraine. That partnership has direct battlefield consequences, and European capitals understand the implication. Moscow's isolation is Western isolation, not global isolation. The Tehran platform also creates deliberate ambiguity. When Medvedev issues warnings about Germany from Moscow, it's official Russian policy. When he issues them from Tehran during a funeral visit, interpretive space emerges. Is this formal doctrine or opportunistic commentary? The ambiguity is tactical. It allows Russian officials to calibrate responses based on European reactions, escalating if the warnings are dismissed, moderating if they're taken seriously. Meanwhile, the message circulates regardless. European foreign ministries must analyze it, brief leadership, and formulate responses. The strategic conversation has been forced, but the choice of Tehran carries a third dimension that most analysis missed: energy. Iran remains a swing producer in global oil markets. Russia and Iran together possess enough energy leverage to affect European industrial recovery. The funeral venue subtly reminds Berlin that Moscow's partnerships extend into domains where Germany remains vulnerable. It's not explicit, no statements were made about energy coordination, but the subtext is clear to anyone tracking Europe's ongoing struggle with energy costs and deindustrialization pressures. The second strategic level targets Germany specifically, and the targeting is surgical. Berlin occupies a unique position in European security architecture. It's NATO's economic anchor, but lacks the military culture of France or Britain and the threat perception of Poland or the Baltics. Germany's current ruling coalition, Social Democrats, Greens, and Free Democrats, was already fracturing over Ukraine policy before Medvedev's warnings. Chancellor Scholz faces pressure from his own party to prioritize economic recovery over continued military aid. German public opinion shows measurable war fatigue. Industrial sectors are hemorrhaging competitiveness due to high energy costs that trace directly back to lost Russian gas supplies. Russia's calculation is straightforward. If Germany can be pressured into advocating for negotiations that freeze current conflict lines, European consensus collapses. Poland and the Baltic states would resist, but without German economic backing and political weight, their resistance becomes isolated. The warnings Medvedev issued weren't detailed deliberately so. He referenced unacceptable red lines regarding long-range weapons and NATO infrastructure without specifying exact thresholds. This vagueness is the mechanism. It transforms every German decision about Ukraine support into a potential trigger for escalation. Should Berlin approve Taurus missile transfers? The Russian warning didn't specify Taurus, but it didn't exclude them either. The ambiguity activates risk aversion, Germany's dominant strategic reflex. This approach exploits a historical pattern. Germany has consistently been the Western European nation most willing to accommodate Russian security concerns when economic incentives align. Nord Stream symbolized that accommodation. The pipelines are gone, but Moscow is testing whether the underlying psychology remains, whether German leadership facing economic contraction and political instability might choose de-escalation over confrontation if presented with sufficiently stark choices. The third strategic level elevates Belarus from client state to integral Russian territory. This isn't rhetorical inflation. It's an attempt to establish a new geopolitical norm through declaration and repetition. By framing Belarus as equivalent to Russian soil and threatening nuclear response to any external threat, Moscow seeks to expand its security perimeter westward without formal annexation. The nuclear rhetoric serves specific purposes. Domestically, it reassures Lukashenko that his regime enjoys absolute Russian protection, critical after 2020's protests demonstrated his domestic vulnerability. Internationally, it creates a tripwire scenario that complicates NATO planning. Western military analysts have occasionally discussed intervention scenarios if Belarus were to experience another popular uprising or if Lukashenko's regime collapsed suddenly. These discussions, mostly theoretical, envision Polish or Baltic involvement to prevent refugee flows or secure nuclear materials. Russia's nuclear threat, contextualized specifically around Belarus defense, is designed to preempt those scenarios by raising the perceived stakes to unacceptable levels. It transforms Belarus from a country experiencing internal political crisis into a potential nuclear flashpoint. The goal isn't to use nuclear weapons, it's to ensure that Western capitals never seriously consider intervention by making the perceived risks catastrophic. What makes Russia's approach genuinely sophisticated is the integration. One diplomatic trip, one news cycle, 3 distinct messages to 3 separate audiences, all mutually reinforcing. To Tehran's incoming leadership, Russia remains your committed strategic partner regardless of succession outcomes. To Germany, your Ukraine policy carries direct consequences for your own security, and we're willing to escalate if you cross lines we've deliberately left undefined. To Belarus, you're protected by Russia's nuclear umbrella, rendering you untouchable. To NATO collectively, the eastern border of Europe is now defined by Moscow's red lines, not by alliance expansion plans or sovereignty principles. The timing optimized multiple variables simultaneously. European unity on Ukraine is visibly weakening as economic costs mount and battlefield progress stalls. Germany's coalition government is approaching potential collapse. U.S. political attention is divided by domestic concerns and multiple international commitments. Iran's leadership transition created a natural news event that justified Medvedev's presence in the region, providing diplomatic cover for what was fundamentally a European-focused strategic messaging operation. The funeral became the excuse. The warnings to Germany were the substance. Russia's strategy succeeds if it introduces doubt into European decision-making processes. It doesn't require Germany to immediately reverse Ukraine policy or NATO to publicly accept Belarus as Russian territory. It requires hesitation, internal debate, risk assessment paralysis. Every week that Germany delays weapons transfers while evaluating whether they cross Russian red lines is a week Ukraine doesn't receive those systems. Every NATO planning session complicated by Belarus nuclear tripwire scenarios is a session where deterrence becomes more ambiguous. The strategic effect accumulates incrementally, not dramatically. If Russia succeeds in establishing Belarus as effectively untouchable through nuclear threats, it doesn't just change Belarus's status, it undermines the foundational principle that has governed European security since the Cold War ended: sovereign choice. The precedent would be clear. States in Russia's periphery do not possess full sovereignty if Moscow decides otherwise, and nuclear threats can formalize that arrangement without Western response. Poland and the Baltic states immediately confront a transformed threat landscape. If Belarus is integral Russian territory in Moscow's doctrine, the NATO border effectively shifts westward in Russian strategic calculations. The alliance suddenly faces a dilemma with no satisfactory resolution. Option 1. Formally declare that any Russian use of Belarusian territory for attacks on NATO members triggers Article 5 collective defense. This expands NATO commitments precisely when alliance cohesion is strained, resources are stretched, and public support in key member states is wavering. It also creates legal and political complications. Article 5 was designed to respond to attacks on member states, not attacks staged from third countries that Russia claims as its own territory. Option 2. Tacitly accept Russia's framing that Belarus occupies a special status outside normal sovereignty rules. This legitimizes sphere of influence doctrine that NATO officially rejects and has spent 3 decades trying to dismantle. It signals to Georgia, Moldova, and potentially even Armenia that their sovereignty is negotiable if Russia decides to formalize control. Neither option is acceptable, yet NATO must choose or accept the strategic ambiguity that follows from choosing neither, which itself constitutes a choice with consequences. For Germany, the consequences are immediate and intensely political. If Berlin is perceived as softening Ukraine policy in response to Russian pressure, delaying weapons transfers, advocating for negotiations that freeze conflict lines, reducing financial commitments, it fractures European unity and validates Moscow's theory that targeted threats against individual members work better than broad pressure against the alliance collectively. Poland, the Baltic states, and likely France would view German accommodation as betrayal, creating the deepest intra-European security division since the Iraq War. But if Germany hardens its position to demonstrate resolve, accelerating weapons deliveries, expanding training programs, increasing financial commitments, it accepts escalation risks that German public opinion and political culture show limited appetite for absorbing. Recent polling indicates German voters prioritize economic recovery and energy security over indefinite Ukraine support. The governing coalition's internal divisions reflect this tension. Russia wins regardless of which path Germany chooses. Either Berlin shifts policy in Moscow's preferred direction, or Germany's internal political fractures deepen as hawks and doves battle over response, reducing Berlin's effectiveness as Europe's strategic anchor. The energy dimension remains operationally relevant despite Nord Stream's destruction. Germany's industrial competitiveness has measurably declined due to high energy costs. Chemical production, steel manufacturing, and energy-intensive sectors are relocating or shutting down. Further escalation risks additional economic warfare measures. Russia still supplies some European nations with gas, creating leverage Moscow could activate. Germany is poorly positioned to absorb another energy shock while simultaneously funding Ukraine support and rebuilding military capabilities. Globally, Russia's funeral diplomacy model establishes a pattern that other authoritarian states are certainly analyzing, using each other's diplomatic events as platforms for third-party messaging fragments. Western intelligence analysis, which typically compartmentalizes by region. Middle East desks analyze Tehran, Europe desks analyze Berlin. Few structures exist to synthesize cross-regional authoritarian coordination in real time. This creates multiple simultaneous pressure points that Western governments must address with finite attention and resources. China is watching the Belarus precedent with particular interest. The Taiwan Strait scenario contains obvious parallels: an authoritarian power claiming a neighbor as integral territory, threatening military action to prevent Western involvement, leveraging nuclear capabilities to deter intervention. If Russia successfully establishes that nuclear threats can formalize control over neighbors without triggering meaningful Western response, Beijing gains a tested playbook. The strategic implications extend far beyond Eastern Europe. Iran benefits structurally from this dynamic. Tehran becomes diplomatically central to European security discussions, elevating its strategic importance to Russia and demonstrating that Iranian partnerships deliver global reach, not just regional influence. Whoever emerges from Khamenei's succession inherits a Russia relationship that provides tangible strategic value, diplomatic leverage, advanced military technology, coordinated pressure on shared adversaries, not merely weapon sales or rhetorical solidarity. The consequences cascade across domains. Economically, Russia-Iran coordination could affect global energy markets and European energy security simultaneously. Militarily, weapons technology transfers between Moscow and Tehran force NATO to account for capabilities in multiple theaters, drones proven in Ukraine appearing in Middle Eastern conflicts, air defense systems tested against Israeli strikes informing Russian deployments in Europe. Diplomatically, Western nations face coordinated pressure from a multi-regional authoritarian bloc that shares intelligence, synchronizes messaging, and exploits the structural reality that democracies struggle to maintain coherent long-term strategies across administrations, while authoritarian states maintain policy continuity across decades. The architecture is already shifting. The question is whether Western capitals recognize the shift quickly enough to respond effectively. 4 realistic scenarios could emerge from Russia's gambit, each depending on variables currently in flux across European capitals, Washington and Tehran. Scenario 1 involves European division and Russian strategic success. Germany's coalition government, already fracturing over Ukraine policy and facing mounting domestic pressure over industrial decline, begins quietly advocating for negotiations that would freeze current conflict lines. Berlin frames this as pragmatic diplomacy, but the substance implicitly accepts Russian territorial gains and shelves Ukraine's NATO aspirations indefinitely. Poland and the Baltic states react with fury, viewing German accommodation as betrayal that directly threatens their security. Public statements remain diplomatic, but behind closed doors, Warsaw and Vilnius question whether they can rely on Berlin, and by extension, whether NATO's collective defense guarantees retain credibility. The United States attempts to maintain alliance unity through diplomatic pressure and economic incentives, but the effort fails because the underlying interests have diverged too sharply. Germany prioritizes industrial recovery and energy cost reduction. Eastern Europe prioritizes existential security guarantees against Russian expansion. These priorities cannot be reconciled through compromise. They require fundamentally different Ukraine outcomes. Russia reads the visible NATO division as validation of its strategy. Moscow incrementally expands Belarus integration, potentially moving tactical nuclear weapons permanently onto Belarusian soil. Western responses remain rhetorical because the alliance cannot agree on concrete measures. This scenario's likelihood depends heavily on German domestic politics over the next 6 months, and whether the US can offer economic incentives substantial enough to counter Berlin's industrial lobby pressures. Scenario 2 involves NATO hardening and corresponding escalation risk. Germany, recognizing that accommodation invites further Russian demands, coordinates with Poland and France to issue a joint statement reaffirming Belarus's sovereignty despite current Russian occupation. The statement explicitly declares that any use of Belarusian territory for attacks on NATO members would trigger Article 5 collective defense provisions. NATO follows with concrete actions: increased forward deployment in Poland and the Baltics, enhanced air policing, pre-positioned equipment expansions. The alliance frames these moves explicitly as responses to Russian threats, rejecting any ambiguity about Belarus's status. Russia responds with large-scale military exercises in Belarus that simulate tactical nuclear weapons use against NATO infrastructure. Both sides dig in rhetorically and militarily, creating conditions where incidents carry disproportionate escalation risk. A border provocation, airspace violation, or intelligence operation gone wrong could trigger responses that neither side fully controls. This scenario depends on European leaders calculating that demonstrating weakness now invites cascading Russian demands later, that credible deterrence requires visible pushback despite the risks. It also requires confidence that Russia is bluffing about nuclear use, a judgment that carries catastrophic consequences if wrong. Scenario 3 involves managed stalemate and sustained ambiguity. Neither full capitulation nor direct confrontation occurs. Germany issues generic statements supporting Ukraine and NATO unity while quietly slowing weapons delivery timelines and encouraging diplomatic initiatives that Russia predictably rejects, but which provide Berlin political cover domestically. Russia maintains its Belarus integration trajectory, but avoids overt provocations that would force unambiguous NATO responses: no formal annexation, no permanent nuclear basing announcements, no cross-border incidents. Both sides settle into an ambiguous status quo. Rhetoric remains sharp, actions stay below thresholds that would require definitive responses. Belarus becomes a frozen conflict in all but name, officially sovereign, practically Russian-controlled, with neither side willing to force resolution. This scenario emerges if both Moscow and NATO conclude that their current positions are sustainable and that forcing the issue carries risks disproportionate to potential gains. It requires mutual acceptance of ambiguity, which often proves more durable than formal agreements, because it allows each side to claim they haven't conceded core principles. Scenario 4 centers on the Iran dimension becoming strategically central in ways that reshape the entire equation. Khamenei's succession could produce internal instability or leadership that recalibrates Iran's Russia relationship, reducing the strategic coordination that Moscow relies on to demonstrate viable non-Western alternatives. Alternatively, deepening Russia-Iran military cooperation, advanced aircraft sales, nuclear technology, sharing integrated air defense systems could trigger Israeli or U.S. military action. A Middle Eastern crisis requiring significant Russian attention and resources would reduce pressure on the European theater, potentially creating space for de-escalation that currently doesn't exist. This scenario depends on variables largely outside Moscow's control. Tehran's internal succession dynamics, regional developments in the Middle East, Israeli threat assessments, U.S. willingness to accept increased Iran-Russia military integration. It's the least predictable scenario because it hinges on actors whose decision-making processes remain opaque and whose interests don't align perfectly with Russia's European objectives. Key determinants that will select among these scenarios include Germany's domestic political trajectory over the next 6 months as coalition tensions either resolve or fracture the government, U.S. willingness and capacity to offer economic incentives that counter German industrial interests in de-escalation, Iran's succession outcome and the new leadership's strategic orientation toward Russia. The next major development in Ukraine that reshapes public narratives about the conflict's trajectory. Polish and Baltic willingness to publicly break with Germany if Berlin accommodates Russian pressure, and Chinese signals regarding support for Russia's approach, which would indicate whether authoritarian coordination is deepening or remains opportunistic. The timeline matters. The next 6 to 12 months represent a critical period when initial responses will establish patterns that become difficult to reverse. Russia didn't just attend a funeral in Tehran, it demonstrated that in the emerging multipolar order, geography no longer constrains strategy the way it did throughout the Cold War and the unipolar decades that followed. The same diplomatic mission that paid respects to Iran's supreme leader simultaneously redrew red lines in Europe, proving that modern geopolitical competition operates across regions in ways that Western analytical structures struggle to comprehend. The structural problem is organizational. Western governments compartmentalize by region. Middle East desks analyze Iran, Europe desks analyze Belarus, intelligence fusion centers attempt synthesis, but often fail to connect events separated by thousands of miles and seemingly different strategic contexts. Russia, China, and Iran don't operate under this limitation. They view their partnerships as integrated tools applicable wherever leverage exists, whoever the target happens to be, whatever domain offers optimal impact. The Medvedev mission succeeded before any European policy changes occurred. Success wasn't measured in immediate German capitulation or NATO withdrawal. It was measured in forcing European leaders to recognize they face coordinated pressure from an authoritarian bloc that spans continents, shares strategic objectives, and synchronizes messaging across diplomatic events that Western analysis treats as separate. The demonstration itself was the victory. Whether Russia's specific demands regarding Germany and Belarus ultimately succeed matters less than what the episode revealed. Authoritarian states can now use each other's diplomatic platforms to issue third-party threats, confident their partnerships provide genuine alternatives if Western relations deteriorate further. This isn't rhetorical solidarity, it's operational coordination with battlefield and economic consequences. The funeral in Tehran was the venue. The real event was the message to Europe. The post-Cold War security order where the West established rules and others adapted is finished. Russia now sets terms using partnerships the West dismissed as marriages of convenience in combinations traditional analysis didn't predict because it categorized by region rather than by shared strategic logic. The question isn't whether Russia used Khamenei's funeral to redraw Europe's eastern border. The evidence demonstrates it did. The question is whether Western capitals can adapt their strategic thinking fast enough to recognize that events in Tehran and threats to Germany are no longer separate stories, requiring separate analyses by separate departments producing separate assessments that arrive at different conclusions. They never were separate. And as China watches as Iran's new leadership consolidates, and as Europe's unity faces its severest test since the Cold War ended, the real question becomes, how many more times will the West be surprised by strategies that connect regions we've trained ourselves to analyze in isolation?